In this session, we move out of Genesis and the stories of creation and the patriarchs into the story of the experiences of God's people in Egypt. The Exodus is the central event of the Old Testament. The term Exodus can refer to two things. Historically, it refers to the flight of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Of course, the term can also refer to the book in the Old Testament. Repeatedly, the Old Testament refers back to this story and the actions of God and the Israelites in it. Moses, the leader of the Exodus, is often thought of as the most important leader of the Old Testament. As you can tell from your reading, a lot happened between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. While in Egypt, the Israelites prospered and grew in numbers. A new king, or Pharaoh, rose to power, and he saw these outsiders, these foreigners, as a potential threat. In order to secure his empire, he planned to destroy the Israelites. First, he enslaved them and tried to work them to death. As we see in the scripture reading for this session, that plan did not work. For example, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 12, we saw that the harder Pharaoh treated the Israelites, the more they grew. As a result, he tried another tactic by ordering that all of the baby boys be killed. As tragic as this story is, we still see God's hand working in the midst of darkness. As we read in chapter 1, verse 17, when Pharaoh planned to have the boys killed, the nurses who helped deliver the children feared God and allowed the babies to live. Because of this faithfulness, God blessed the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply and grow more powerful. Last, we saw God at work in the story of Moses. Here, a boy who Pharaoh wanted killed because he was an Israelite, and yet Moses is raised in Pharaoh's own home. It is in the beginning of this story of suffering and deliverance that we see the importance of humanity in the Old Testament. If you recall, Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, tells us of the Israelites crying out to God and God remembering. Now, for us, this phrase does not make sense. Did God forget the Israelites? Did he fail to recall that he had made a covenant with the patriarchs? We separate what one thinks or believes from what one does. We separate the mind from the body. For example, we will use the phrase, "I know what to do, but I just can't do it." The Old Testament's view of humanity is very different. It does not separate what we think or believe from what we do. In fact, in the Old Testament, if someone said they were a Jew but did not live accordingly, the Bible said they forgot God. Psalm 106 illustrates this concept too. So when these verses in Exodus say God heard their cries and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it is a brief way of saying that God knew what he had committed to and acted upon it. It reminds us that we cannot separate what we believe from what we do. Biblically, if what we do is not aligned with what we say we believe, then our actions deny our belief. Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25 introduce us to the way God delivered or remembered the Israelites. We only read about a few of the plagues, but there were a total of 10 increasingly severe plagues. We need to recognize that there was no need for one plague, much less 10. God gave Pharaoh the opportunity to release the Israelites and avoid the plagues before the very first one and after each plague. However, Pharaoh thought he could resist the will of God. The plagues increased in severity and significance until the 10th plague. In this plague, the firstborn of every person or animal would be killed. This plague should remind you of the work of Christ on the cross. The death of the firstborn and only Son of God secured our release from the prison of sin. The story of the plagues also demonstrates the compassion of God. Did you notice that the plagues did not visit the Israelites? The entire time, God was looking out for his people. The story of the Exodus also introduces us to Moses. As you were reading, did you wonder why God picked Moses? He was born into a life of luxury, yet God used him to lead a long and harsh journey. He was not raised among the people he would be called to lead. He did not even recognize the presence of God at the burning bush. Also, when God called him to lead, Moses tries to reject the choice. He complained that the people would not listen, that he couldn't speak well, and that the people would not believe him. So why did God choose him? Perhaps God's choice did two things. First, it ensured that God received the glory. No one can say that Moses did it on his own because of his greatness and competence. Second, it helped affirm God's use of us. God can readily use us, even when we don't see ourselves worthy of being used. We end by looking at an important part of this story found in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. When God tells Moses to go lead the Israelites, Moses asks God, "Who do I say sent me?" In a sense, Moses is asking, "God, what is your name?" God responds, "I am who I am." It is from this phrase that we get the name Yahweh. It is a name used repeatedly for God in the Old Testament. In an unusual response, when Moses asks for God's name, God doesn't state his name, but instead describes himself by saying, "I am who I am." This self-naming by God is very powerful. In it, God is saying that you know me by my actions. To demonstrate this point, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 15, God illustrates the way he was active in the life of the patriarchs. How do we know who God is? We know him by how he is active in our lives in the present, and how he has been active in our lives in the past. This lets us know who he will be in our future. With these ideas in mind, spend some time on the relational questions exploring how you can live out the scripture we studied.